Hi, I'm Dan Schmitt. I do a weekly television show called Team Chicago Challenge. The website is teamchicago.tv, teamchicago.tv. I was also the candidate for Congress in the 5th Congressional District in 2012. I ran an honorable campaign, but I failed to raise enough money, so it was sort of not a great deal. My fault. I should have spent more time raising money. And you need money. Money is, what did they say? Money is the mother's milk of politics. So anyhow, today, as I go on with my concept, because when I was campaigning, I found out how many people, which the term I'm using, were ill-educated. People went to college, people that went to university, learned a lot of things, but when it comes to America, what greatness of America, a lot of people seem to be lacking. And I'm calling this, they are ill-educated. Not that there's anything wrong with what they've accomplished in their life, but they have been ill-educated. So, let me begin this by bringing up one subject. And this is another one of them taboo subjects, but because I'm politically incorrect, I can go into these subjects. We're going to talk about Pope Francis and wealth distribution. Let me first say that I am a Roman Catholic. I spent 8 years, really 9 years if you count kindergarten, at Our Lady of Mercy on the northwest side of Chicago. Then I spent 4 years at St. George High School. All those years I did have religious classes. I remember having my Baltimore Catechism, which you studied in 1st and 2nd grade, to learn about the Catholic Church, the rules of the Catholic Church. Then all during my education, in fact, I probably have more religious education than most of these preachers and most of these ministers at these mega churches. So I do know something about the Catholic Church. And the reason I want to talk about the new Pope, Pope Francis, is because he does talk about wealth redistribution. In fact, he had a meeting at, on May 9th in 2014. He brought in a few of the leaders from the UN were at Vatican City, Ban Ki-moon, who is the General Secretary, and he talked about economics of exclusion and state-led global initiative to close the gap of wealthy nations and poor nations. Now, there's been Vatican spokesmen that have come out and said, well, you're not understanding exactly what the Holy Father has said. He said it. He said wealth redistribution, the rich and poor, the difference between rich and poor. So let me give you a little brief history on Pope Francis and why I considered him to be ill-educated or did not benefit from being born in the good old USA like me. First of all, Pope Francis was born in 1936. That means he's 13 years older than I. We should also mention he's from Argentina. Now, Argentina is sort of a failed state as far as I'm concerned. For the first 300 years, from the 1500s to the 1800s, it was under the domination of Spain, which means that there was no real freedom. Not the freedom that is part of the English descendant. We are fortunate, being in the United States of America, we can trace our freedom, our concept of freedom, back to the Magna Carta from 1215. Under the Magna Carta, basically, the noblemen held their swords to the king, I believe it was King John, and they told King John, you can be the king, but you also have to obey the laws. You are not above the law. This is all part of, if you read the founding fathers of the United States, a lot of them make reference back to the Magna Carta. The formation of Parliament in England. We have benefited from all this. The whole common law, the idea of a jury of your peers, a jury of 12 members. This is all part of that English law, the English that we have benefited from in the United States of America. The Constitution, if you listen to Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, Madison, Jefferson, all of them will go back and state, they will make reference, they even make reference back to democracies in Greece. They'll even make reference to Rome, and where Rome had, the Senate ran it until Caesar came along and declared himself emperor. And that's one of the reasons Caesar was murdered. So, our Pope, our dear Pope, did not benefit from any of this. In fact, when he was 9 years old, Peron became into the leadership. And then he was 20 years old when Peron got thrown out. So what was Domingo Peron? What was Juan Domingo Peron, I believe his name was? He basically ran a fascist state. So these formative years of our Pope came under from the time he was 9 years old to the time he's 20 years old. And he wasn't in the seminary or nothing. He wasn't studying to be a priest. He went out and he worked. He was a chemical worker, and they even say he was a bouncer in a nightclub. So his influence came out of this fascist regime under Peron. And under Peron, it was, he combined unions, he combined industrialists, he combined the Catholic Church and the bureaucracy of the government, and that's what ran the government. But the military was very much involved. And that's how they controlled the population. So the idea of free enterprise that we have in America is not part of our dear Pope's upbringing. So I can understand. They say he worked among the poor in Buenos Aires. They say he has adapted from the poor. Even when he became the archbishop, he became a Jesuit priest when he was 33. He became the archbishop in 1998, I believe, and then he became the cardinal in 2001 under Pope John Paul II, raised him to be a cardinal. So there's a big contrast with this wealth redistribution. So let me remind my audience out there who may not know anything about the Catholic Church, because I make reference, and I made reference before, to Pope Leo. In 1890, Pope Leo established, now listen to this, ownership. Property ownership is the right of the humans. Property ownership is the right of the people. It is normal. It is nature's law to own things, okay? Now, people also refer to his writings in 1890 and say, well, he also talked about dignity of work and the dignity of treatment of labor and the treatment of workers and the employees and the employers. And he laid out a whole, and everything that Pope Leo laid out in 1890 is now common practice in the United States of America. Workers are treated well in the United States of America. Now, unions will take credit for it. The union movement will take credit for it. But we have come a long way. We are still on the top when it comes to treatment of labor, people working for a decent wage. That's why America is so wealthy, is because we do treat people well. People can make money, people can keep their money, and they work harder because Americans are still the most productive people in the entire world. And a lot of it because we have listened to Pope Leo in 1890. Then I should bring up Pope John Paul. It was Pope John Paul working with that half-Catholic president and Margaret Thatcher, the United States President Ronald Reagan, who was half Catholic. It was the hand of God between Pope John Paul II, Ronald Reagan, and Margaret Thatcher that caused the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was the hand of God. I am one of the tens of millions of students in Catholic school that prayed hundreds of millions of rosaries to free Russia from communism. Do you know that? Do you remember that people went to Catholic school? Do you remember this stuff? Am I the only one that remembers that we prayed the rosary to free Russia from communism? And it was the hand of God working with the Pope, working with Ronald Reagan, President Ronald Reagan, and working with Margaret Thatcher that brought down the Soviet Union without firing a shot. Does anybody realize this? Okay. So let me go back to our dear Pope Francis. He is uninformed. He's trying to say the right thing. Wealth redistribution. There are wealthy nations like the United States. There are poor nations. So I have two questions for the Pope, and I'm going to send this to different priests in the Chicago Archdiocese. I'm going to send it to Cardinal George. I'm going to send it to the Archbishop out in DuPage County, out in Joliet Diocese. And I want some of these priests to answer me. So I have two questions for Pope Francis. Question number one. It's 196 countries in this world. Out of these 196, maybe 50 can be considered cultured, normal, free elections, honest people running government. Maybe 50 out of 196. The other 146 are run by tyrants, morons, criminals. I mean, just look at Mexico. Just look at Central America. How many of these countries does Pope Francis think, if the United Nations levied some kind of tax to take money from us in America to redistribute it to the rest of the world, do you honestly believe money would get to the poor? The United States has been given billions and billions and billions of dollars to the rest of the countries and the rest of the world, and probably 80% of it is stolen. You want to talk about Somalia 20 years ago? You want to talk, where do you want to talk about? Where the people never get anything. If Pope Francis wants to help the countries and the rest of the world, just like Pope John Paul II knew communism was evil, and he said it, and he worked with Ronald Reagan, he worked with Margaret Thatcher, and they brought down the evil. This Pope should be out there trying to educate the rest of the world to true democracy, to find proper, if every country in this world had the Constitution of the United States of America, if every country in the world had this English common law, this American Constitution, if they all had that, they wouldn't be poor. The reason they're poor, because I believe all humans are equal. I believe all humans are made in the image of God. So that's number one. How would this work? And the more tricky question for our Pope, I don't know if I spelled it right. Thou shalt not covet. Another, the 10 Commandments, because I learned the 10 Commandments. We call them the 10 Commandments. The Jewish friends of mine have 300 commandments, but we go by 10. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods is one of the 10 Commandments. So my question, and any of the priests out there I send this to, how are you going to distribute wealth without coveting, without disobeying the 10 Commandments. We know the 10 Commandments were written by the hand of God, by the finger of God, because this is such a powerful, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Written by the finger of God to help people live together, to avoid jealousy, to avoid inner fighting. So I want to know, Pope Francis, how are you going to redistribute wealth and not covet thy neighbor's goods? Again, I'm Dan Schmitt. My website is teamchicago.tv. My other website is walkwithdan.com. That's the political website. If you want to send me an email, you can send me an email at teamdan45@gmail.com. And anybody wants to debate me on this, I'm interested. I will debate you anywhere. Wealth redistribution is a fantasy. We have to live in reality. We have to help these other countries accept freedom, the right, freedom, small government, the left, big government, big control, freedom, responsibility. Again, I'm Dan Schmitt, teamchicago.tv, walkwithdan.com, teamdan45@gmail.com. And if anybody wants to debate me, I will meet you any place, anytime. Open forum, whatever. I want to know, and I hope some of the priests, the cardinal, and the bishops respond to this. How can we talk of wealth redistribution and not disobey one of the 10 Commandments?